So بدي أعرف دكتور مونيكا بس بالإنجليش لأن she speaks English as well. So Dr. Monika Halkort is Assistant Professor of Digital Media and Social Communication at the Lebanese American University in the Department of Communication Arts. Her research explores the social life of data, focusing in particular on the relationship between digital infrastructure and political claim-making in the context of social struggle and humanitarian aid. Her focus, or geographic focus, of her work is the Arab region. Today she's going to talk to us about the power of data, especially in times of war and conflict. Thank you, Monika.
Can you hear me? 1, 2, 3, yeah, okay. Yes, so thanks for the nice introduction, Lubna. There are 3 kind of big questions I want to explore with you, but together I hope we can make them a bit smaller and break them up. So basically, I will be talking about data, yes, but very much so about data in regards to what kind of a relationship do we really have to data? In what kind of a relationship do indeed we exist with data? Who is data to us? What are we to data? And what does all this mean in terms of an ethical practice? What are our responsibilities? What are our obligations vis-a-vis data? Which is becoming, as you can imagine, a huge debate, and it's becoming particularly marked in times of conflict, where data has become ever more essential to provide aid, to provide emergency services, to rescue lives. So it becomes a life and death issue, really. But as you will see as we go along, there are a lot of issues that are still unresolved, because data remains this kind of abstract thing that sits on our phones, that is somewhere collected all the time. You've heard it in the privacy and security lecture. And yet this invisibility of data, the fact that you cannot touch it and you can't smell it, it doesn't kind of show up somewhere, or only in the form of an image. But you never see what the full amount of data that actually goes into an image. All these kind of invisibilities and intangibilities of data make it very hard to kind of relate it to us as really, or to think about what kind of a part of us as individual persons and of people who have feelings, who have rights, who have certain demands and expectation towards the world, how data plays a role in this, and how we should kind of regulate it and deal with it as professionals, as media professionals, as journalists, as humanitarian professionals, when we are increasingly engaging with people and in the extreme and trying to save lives on the basis of data decisions, right? So this is roughly the core kind of topic that I would like to discuss with you today. So you've seen it in the privacy and Moses, I think is his name, in the privacy security, the drone lecture. The example of Ushahidi came up, right? The collective mapping, people coming together in a moment of crisis, Haiti earthquake, people were in desperate needs of food, of water, bridges were falling down, and yet no one had a proper map of Haiti. I won't go into the colonial kind of background of this, why there are certain places in the world that actually are not properly mapped as compared to rich industrial northern nations. But let's say the world community finally came together, joined its intelligence, used the new technologies available, sat around the table and started based on their knowledge, what they knew about Haiti, so that aid workers on the site could actually come and rescue people and provide essential needs, right? So it's still held as one of the primary examples, even in the discussion among humanitarian practitioners and scholars researching data in the context of humanitarianism, as a primary example of the big promise of data-driven media, of the new ways of seeing, of engaging with the world, these new data-driven technologies, image satellites, internet connections, open data mapping tools, what all those tools afforded in terms of creating a new extended awareness of problems, for one, but also creating new conditions of possibility for people helping each other, which is basically a good thing, right? So Ushahidi here, the big promise for technology fostering a new kind of togetherness, a new kind of sociality, a new kind of ways of people to enter into societies based on their own choices, based on immediate needs, and so a promising new way forward. What you didn't hear is that Ushahidi was not used, or similar tools were used in many, many different places with many, many different outcomes. This is an example, map KIBERA. KIBERA is a very notorious kind of deeply impoverished urban district in Nairobi, Kenya. Kenya haunted by severe, what was labeled ethnic violence, let's call it civil violence. In any case, in the aftermath of this violence, people started to realize, well, actually, we should do something. We need to improve people's lives so that we maybe rebundle, redirect energies towards people working on their future rather than destroying each other, right? And one of those outcomes was, okay, so let's go into the poorest areas where there's no running water, where there's no hammams, like taking a shower can take you half a day. Let's map these environments and ask the people, what are your priorities? What do you actually need to make your lives better and easier so that you can live a happy life? So an ambitious initiative, right? And again, volunteers went out, walked around the slum with mobile phones, and asked people kind of notorious spots or where things are missing. Where do you need this toilet to go? Where should there be a bus line, etc., right? What soon became apparent is that because for so long, 20, 40, 50, 70 years, no government official has set a foot into this district, made, of course, people highly suspicious. Who are these NGO people coming in here wanting to know all these things about us, right? And who are actually the people working with them? Are they kind of spying on us? What do they want? How can they use the information they are collecting and asking from me, actually? So there were severe problems of mistrust, of competition, of power struggles, because all of the NGOs flying in from the US, you know, they parachute into these locations for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they leave. They have no local knowledge. So they depend on people from the environment to collaborate with them and convince the rest of the community to share information with them, right? But that's a very difficult position if you're dealing with a population that's highly suspicious and mistrustful against the NGO organizing such an event, right? So these intermediaries, the people collecting the data from the community, were all of a sudden a special class of people within this community. They used to be just your neighbor. All of a sudden, it became this new person with, first of all, more money, extreme power, because they now know everything about the neighborhood. So it changed completely their position within the immediate environment, right? And it created a lot of problems with people not sharing information. I've done my own research in refugee camps here, Palestinian camps, where people started simply to cheat. They would tell you anything, because in this case data collection was linked to funding checks and furniture checks for a home that was destroyed. Of course people start to trade and play the system, right? And say, well, whatever I had lost was kind of tenfold more than they actually had, just to get as much as they can out of aid communities. So I'm just mentioning this to say all of these problems, they're far bigger problems when technology enters into communities that have always been in rather desperate situations and can very quickly take a very negative turn if all these strangers enter into very tightly knit communities by the use of technology and start to change things for the better, right? Another example, Darfur, everyone aware, Sudan, in this region, I don't have to mention it. But what happened here is that, and it happens a lot, that with the use of image satellites, we can now, from the comfort of our home in Vienna, in New York, in Japan, call up a Google map or an open data map and start mapping individual neighborhoods in conflict areas to identify where is their village, what kind of a village is this, to kind of help aid workers on the ground to direct them to places they may not know exist because there is no map available on site, etc. Right? So in the case of Darfur, Amnesty just did this, but ended up, because it was an ethnically driven conflict at the time, but ended up producing a whole new map based on ethnic belonging that fell into the hands of the wrong people and which was then used to kind of not help people, but by the enemy to kill their opponents in the war, right? So what started as a very ambitious attempt to kind of help aid workers in the ground come to the rescue of people in danger became a weapon of war between the warring factions. And all of this happened because data was not protected well enough or was always in the open anyways, and simply could be abused, right? Another similar crisis emerged during the Ebola crisis. Here the case was that quite often, because most of the data, it's not very clearly regulated how data can be used and by whom, that aid agencies used anonymized phone data to locate certain people and then link this information to kind of health information. In any case, a long story short, what happened is that personal data, location-based data, could be linked to information whether someone is infected with Ebola or not, which very quickly, again, came into the wrong hands, and those people could be identified and were then shunned from their villages, thrown out, or even physically attacked, right? So another big accident in regards to the use of data for humanitarian imaginations. And if we just look at the numbers, in the first 6 months of 2016 alone, over 500 million of such personal sensitive data was released accidentally or purposefully stolen or leaked and potentially caused harm to all those people whose lives is affected by this data. So it's a very sensitive kind of new entity we are dealing with, our personal data, that demands the utmost level of protection and care. And it's not that the humanitarian community has not acknowledged this. Of course they have, right? And it is, as you can see, the right to data privacy and security is explicitly built into the moral and legal obligation and their mandate of humanitarian agencies. And yet we can see, because of the complexity of situations, because there's so many unpredictable factors, things you can never control, that even the best intentions, by the flip of a coin, can turn completely in the other direction and go horribly wrong, right? And so, again, the humanitarian community is of course greatly aware of this, and together with the Harvard School have developed a new enhanced code of ethics, of data ethics, specifically for humanitarian practice, to kind of hoping to minimize such risks and threats that I have shown you to happen again, right? And I won't go into them into much detail, but zero in on just one, which is the one in the left corner here, the right to data agency. As you can see, the right to protection increasingly here is rewritten. Right to protection no longer just includes the protection of human lives, but by extension, the protection of these human lives, including and by the means of their data. So the individual life and the data, in fact, are no longer separated. They are treated as one. The right to information, you also have the right to information, to be informed in times of conflict, what's going around you. Right to privacy and security, I just explained why that is important. But at the core of this sits this idea of data agency. Agency, difficult word. Any ideas? What do you roughly associate with data agency? Agency, you heard the word before? Agency, it's a very contested concept, but it basically, some prefer to call it, what it describes is when action, intention, and outcomes come together so that they put you in a position to control the circumstances around you, and to kind of actually fulfill what you set out to do, right? So it's linked to power that you have and control that you enjoy over your immediate life circumstances and the power you enjoy to fulfill your wishes and desires, right? And as we can, as I've just shown you, this is increasingly becoming a data problem, because we no longer exist as physical beings here in the world. I'm no longer just talking to you and dealing with you and responsible to you to deliver a message. While I'm speaking, this is streamed online. So I'm responsible to these invisible people out there as well, right, in what I'm saying. I have to be careful not to offend anyone. But at the same time, Lubna is responsible for me to be protected as I'm screened out there into the world, right? To not be shown in a bad light or not have my words then edited and used in context that I've never used them and come across, again, I don't know, like a retard or whatever, right? So it's my agency doesn't stop here around my body. My agency, the degree of control I have over how I'm seen, how I can achieve what I set out to do here today, increasingly depends how me and everyone else dealing with the data trace I'm leaving behind right this very moment as I'm speaking, how they are dealing with this data as an integral part of me, in a way, right? Because it's produced through my physical actions here in the world. And it's this relationship between the data and the person that remains one of the biggest challenges to put all these very nice and ambitious codes into practice, right? I've summarized here the key legal barriers here, but I think it takes us too long to go over them. Let me jump to the main point that I'm working towards is, so the big question is, how do we need to think about data to make something like data agency possible? Is data a thing, just an extension of me, a virtual extension of me, old media theory? Is it just a symbol, something that represents me? Or is it actually a living thing? This idea of media as extension of man, do you think it's a proper description to the relationship we have with data as I just described it? Well, one possible objection is, it's the very Luhmann, very old media theorist, Niklas Luhmann, media are the extension of man, they are the extended I. It works perfectly well for the idea of television, right? So we sit in our living room, someone is out there with a camera and streams the rest of the world back to us. That's kind of the television model. The data model, as I've just shown you, is different. As I'm sitting in my living room, I'm always already also present in all those other living rooms watching me right now on YouTube, right? So there's no longer a separation between me and my extended presence somewhere else. They're one and the same. So the idea of media being an extension in a way is misleading because it assumes there's a separation between and my data, when in fact, I just told you, this is difficult to imagine if as I'm standing here and at the same time I'm present on YouTube and potentially present anywhere else in the world. So extension as a concept no longer works. Symbol, you heard yesterday about framing and media and representation and how we kind of reconstruct or remodel the world or frame the world in particular ways as we make journalistic decisions, and that still holds true, of course. And yet data are not representations of the world. We are dealing with a different kind of substance of mediality at the moment that doesn't stop with representation. But as I'm represented on a YouTube screen now, I'm basically also embodied by this data on my YouTube screen because my presence is somehow tangible, visible, and can produce similar effects. So data doesn't just represent me, to make it simpler, in a narrow form, representation means standing in for something. Data doesn't do this. Data rather expands my presence into many other different environments, right? And so the sign, the symbol, the language of signs, the symbol, data is standing in for me, doesn't quite work either. So we need a different way of thinking about data. That's a big task, right? And we won't achieve it today. But what I would like you to do is follow me and start thinking a little bit deeper about what data actually is, so that we can then maybe arrive at a different understanding of what our relationship is to this new entity we're dealing with here. So one way to describe data is it's a raw element extracted from the world through observation, measurement, experiments, and record keeping. Sounds obvious. A camera that records me, collects data about me, and then disseminates it out into the world. Others have a more narrow understanding and conceive data as already organized information, like in a database, a population registry, or even a YouTube library, structured in a way that makes it easy to analyze, compare, and visualize no matter how much of it we have. That very much applies to big data. So these are kind of useful definitions, but do they tell us anything about the kind of relationship we have to data and what data actually is in relation to us? It's a bit too abstract to kind of answer this question, right? So just a little bit of background. The origin of the word data, it actually comes from the Latin language of dare, and that's actually quite a nice metaphor. Dare means to give. So it's something, it's implicitly related to a sharing, right? And to an extending of whoever you are. If you give someone a gift, you're extending your feelings towards this person through the medium of this gift, right? And data, in a way, operates in similar directions. But if we look at what happens to data and how it is used, coming back to the examples with which I started, MDLAB, KIBERA, DARFOUR, etc., data is hardly ever given. No one in DARFOUR was asked whether the data can be used. It was just taken or actually produced about them rather than given, and then used actually to their detriment, right? So there's actually, the word data is actually cheating us, right? Because it's meant to mean something we give voluntarily with our consent. When most of the times, given the technologies of today, it is actually something that is taken from us and extracted from the world. So a better way to describe data as it exists today is capta, something that captures us, our lives, the world around us, to make it available for all sorts of calculations, measurements, and observations, over which we have little control. And that's the critical point where it links back to what I said before, data agency. If agency is the degree of control I enjoy, how I can fulfill my intentions, achieve my goals, and exist in the world, then data used as capta, as a way of capturing elements of my life, are fundamentally opposed to it. And if that's the case, then the very term of data agency starts to become a contradiction in and of itself, right? So there's a conflict, and that's basically what I meant when I said that is precisely the conflict where humanitarian agencies, and everyone in the world actually, is struggling with how do we organize this relationship between us and our data so that data agency ceases to be a contradiction but becomes something that can be used productively and for socially beneficial ends. One of the problems that lies at the heart of this contradiction is that, of course, there's so much data, and even if you just look at one human body, the amount of data that you could collect, starting from your blood, from your heart rate, your blood pressure, etc., is unlimited, right? So for data to become meaningful, it inevitably needs to be made partial and selective to produce some meaningful information, right? And it's here where data can never fully represent a person, but will always give just some version produced for a particular person, purpose of this person, and therefore is ultimately selective and never fully representative of the people, the populations, the individual it claims to represent. And so every single decision that goes into what data we collect in the first place, how we kind of filter and select it, and how we then use it, is really what lies at the heart of our relationship, and how this relationship between us and our data is made to work, and the degrees of control we ultimately have over it. But just to clarify, data is not just a thing that sits in a computer. Data is actually more than one thing. It can be an object, it can be a number, it can be an image, a code, or it can be an absence, something that is missing, right? They come in different shapes and sizes. I'm explicitly using here what you see on the right is a handwritten record from India where people testify land ownership, for instance. And on the right, on the left, you see a book where a video is streamed on top of it. A data-fied kind of recording of a particular land struggle in India, right? So just as examples, the data can take many forms. It's not just an Excel sheet. This is a collection of rice seeds. Each rice seed individually is similar an individual data point. It contains genetic information. It contains information about the environment in which it was grown that it can then take further to work as a seed. If you plant a seed, it produces a similar version of a particular category of plant in any place where you would plant it, right? So seeds in themselves are material data points. So data is not limited to the digital. But there are, of course, structured and many forms of data. This would be an example of structured data, organized data, data already kind of put to use for a particular purpose to show something. This compares activities in Berlin to activities in Moscow, for example. This would be an example of unstructured data. The mess on my desktop, it's my unorganized thoughts, like individual bits and pieces. Data can be many different things and comes in many different forms. I'm not going to go through these, but just to show you, the important question is, how do things become data? How do we end up in these kind of either digital forms, or how does become genetic information be compressed into a singular seed that can be taken anywhere to communicate a particular string of genetic information so that plants can be reproduced wherever they will be planted in the future. So to achieve this, any recording device needs to kind of measure the thing that it wants to capture as a data point, right? So how do we measure? I need to break things down into individual components. I need to know how tall you are, how old you are, where you come from, what your name is, right? So I'm breaking you as a whole person down into individual kind of data points that I can then use to develop different descriptions of yourself. I can put you then in a database that compares the age range of this audience, for example, or I can put it in a database that compares the educational level of everyone sitting in the room, etc., right? But for things to become a data point, they need to be broken down into these individual categories of information to be known about a person, to operate as data set. It's only this breaking down that then allows this data to be put in comparison with other forms, right? And it's, again, at this moment of the breaking down and putting you in comparison or context with other things, where you, as the person that you exist in the world, start to become shaky, right? All sorts of things can be done with the information about you. And it's at this moment where data becomes a very intimate and a very personal thing that may affect our lives very directly and in profound ways. But we are not just measuring people, right? We can measure the environment, we can measure the air, so all these kind of would be ways of transforming physical matter, the air, the water, the dimensions of this room, into individual data points. Here's an example of using selfies as data points, right? It was an automated process. They captured millions of selfies shot in different locations, Sao Paulo, Japan, different cities, Berlin, and compared and took these images to see, are there kind of cultural preferences, are there cultural differences in selfie cultures that we can find when we compare X million Instagram images, right? So that's another example of using the image itself as a data point. 4,500 selfies, not a million. Media, the news. You can use news as data points, right? If you want to compare the hot topics over the course of 10 years, then each kind of headline becomes in itself a data point. That doesn't mean that the news story itself ceases to exist as a story, but just to show you, for a story to become a data point, it needs to be kind of reduced to, okay, what was the topic of the story, who wrote it, when was it written, and where, and in what context, right? So we can, things as they exist in the world change their form, function, and meaning, and are kind of broken down into individual components. That's my main point. This is how things become data. Tweets, increasingly, tweets are used as data points to study food poisoning. Google used to do this with flu warning. When there was a peak in searches for Panadol, Google had its own algorithms to calculate and predict actually flu outbreaks in certain areas, right? It turned out to be a little bit flawed, but increasingly these predictive methodologies are used to predict all sorts of potential problems, like a food poisoning coming up in a city. If people tweet a lot about, oh, I'm throwing up, can't come to work, these may be clusters interesting for health researchers. This is an interesting example of comparing different legal cultures in different countries. But all this goes to say that data, first of all, data doesn't just exist out there in the world, it's drawn and captured from something. And once that happens, it still never speaks for itself in terms of what I said before, representing a person. But once this entity that you have measured is broken down into individual data points, all sorts of things can happen to it. Data no longer speaks for itself and for the context from which it was drawn, but it can be made to speak to all sorts of different audiences, for all sorts of different purposes, and for all sorts of different ends. So the main point to be taken away from this is that when you convert things into data, you inevitably recreate and reconfigure them. They won't stay the same. They enter into a new form of existence. That's the main point I want you to take away from it. We need to disassemble them into individual attributes and values from which we can draw new insights and maybe new understandings of the people that you have measured or of the world itself. And so to return to the earlier point, as you have seen, to be able to do this is on one hand a big promise for making the world and societies better. We've seen this with the mapping initiatives, great potential there. But it comes with severe risks because the relationship, the people over which we now can have information, there's a gross imbalance, let's say, in the degrees of power and control that the people who are mapped in data have over the data that then exists about them, right? And it's this mismatch where the problem of data agency remains fundamentally flawed and unresolved. And it ultimately raises the question, how representative is data really? And how can we make it actually more representative? When I use Google to compare people or to predict the flu, are all people searching for Panadol really kind of suffering from sneezing symptoms? Maybe they just have a headache, right? So there are new uncertainties coming in once we start to look at the world increasingly through our data. But also we are producing new risks because data can fall into wrong hands. And to give you a very powerful example, how data actually, the main point that I'm trying to make here is starting to look at the world through data fundamentally, inevitably, has profound consequences how you think about the world. When I look at you in person, there's a sensory connection we have with each other as we speak in this room, right? Once your physical appearance is gone, and you only exist for me in the form of disassembled data, this human component, the sensory connection to you, and thereby my impulse, the sense of ethical obligation I have towards you, is somewhat minimized, because you no longer appear in front of me as an embodied and fleshed person, right? And so it's this ethical component of the abstraction that is always involved in data production that I'm interested in here now. And to give you an example, what it actually means, there's a very, who has seen the film The Eye of the Sky? Anyone? Okay. So basically, it's usual Hollywood kind of how Hollywood imagines war and crisis situations. Let me show you the trailer, and then I explain the core story of the film. It basically involves the key critical decisions. Military commanders and politicians have to make decisions based on a drone observation of a certain building somewhere in Africa. Should they strike, should they launch an attack on a building and put lives at risk or not because of a terror threat?
This is Colonel Powell. She's going to walk you through the capture of Aisha Al-Hadi, aka Susan Danford.
We have intelligence of a meeting between Danford and numbers 4 and 5 on our most wanted list. We believe that they're connected to the recent suicide bombing in Kenya. We have information that they will be in this house today. This is an operation to capture, not kill.
Range 22,000 feet.
You have your orders, Lieutenant. Your job is to be their eye in the sky.
Yes, ma'am.
I have to know if Danford is inside and who is with her. That's Danford.
Well, this changes things.
What's happened?
Sorry, I have to flip a little bit. So that's the basic setup, right? So drone watching a building, identifying a wanted terrorist haunted by this Helen Mirren, I think is her name, for years, right? Finally, the drone allows her to see. Now, there she is, right? And so she's now communicating remotely with the commander in the control room capable of launching the attack, and the control room back in Britain or wherever it is, negotiating with the politicians, do we have legal clearance to strike, right? So I'm taking you now to the moment, this is the scenario on which politicians and military start to negotiate, can we strike, should we strike, is it kind of legitimate to launch an attack and possibly kill this person now that we have found her, right? And they actually, after the negotiations, decide yes, and then this happens.
Do we have that CD again?
Yes, ma'am.
Good. I know it's a bit earlier, how they arrive at that decision.
Explosives are, we would expect 100% mortality rate in that room and an 80 to 90% rate within the rest of the house. The market should be safe, but
this area here in the street, a 65 to 75% rate. That's just the hellfire. If we factor in the explosives in the vests, we're looking at even more extensive damage way out to this area here. But I can't accurately estimate that yield.
But we would be containing that payload in the vest within those walls, right? Far less collateral damage than them going off in a crowded shopping mall.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, thank you. Obvious to anyone not trying to avoid making a decision.
So, sorry, I forgot that I was going to put this in. The issue here is they are measuring, trying to predict the amount of damage that is produced when they're launching, because inside the house is a suicide vest, and so it's comparing what happens when you bomb a house containing suicide vests. What is the level of damage in the surrounding of this building as compared to these suicide vests are used somewhere in a shopping mall or whatever, right? And based on this comparison, they finally decide, yeah, it's worth the risk we strike, right? But then this happens.
Zoom in.
I'll give her time to walk through.
Ma'am?
You are clear to engage, Lieutenant.
She stopped.
Lieutenant, we have this one opportunity. Let's not lose it.
Ma'am, she's selling bread.
Jesus. Those men are about to disperse. Engage now.
Ma'am, I understand we have clearance. I will fire if I see the ACIs moving or when this girl's out of the frag radius, but I want to give her a chance to get out of the way.
Lieutenant, you have clearance. There is a lot more at stake than you see here in this image.
Ma'am, I need you to run the collateral damage estimate again with this girl up front.
The situation has not changed, Lieutenant. You are cleared to engage.
So, major conflict. A child walks into the scene and completely changes the picture, right? So the dilemma now is...
Steve.
Let's just show you one last scene. Does this change the conditions under which the clearance was given? Are we still entitled to strike, knowing, seeing, being able to measure? There's a child that will inevitably die with it because she is right in the range that was identified on the scanner as the range that will be heavily damaged. And so back in London, I think it is, now I show you the last bit, how politicians negotiate what to do about this situation, how to decide.
It's my recommendation that we should not delay in proceeding with this mission. If we don't act now, we risk losing the lives of up to 80 people.
You can only assume those deaths. What is certain is that if we do act now, this one girl will suffer.
And you would save her and risk killing 80 others?
Yes. I would save her and take that risk. That is what I would do.
Angela, is it you or me who will be invited onto the Today program to explain why we knew of the attack on a shopping centre that killed 80 people but chose to do nothing to stop it?
You, James. But frankly, politically, I'd rather point to Al-Shabaab as murderers of 80 people shopping than have to defend a drone attack by our forces that kills an innocent child.
James, Angela makes a compelling point. If Al-Shabaab kill 80 people, we win the propaganda war. If we kill one child, they do.
The reason why I'm showing you this is because I think it's a very powerful way to illustrate what I've been trying to tell you. How do you think, after watching this, that the fact that they could measure and compare different outcomes, different levels of risks to different kind of people involved in the situation, how did the fact that this is now measurable and damage predictable, how do you think it influenced how this fundamentally ethical challenge was negotiated? Like in the Second World War or in the Lebanese Civil War, people didn't have these predictive capabilities, and not even the capability of looking into the situation in the moment of the attack itself. How do you think that this capacity, this ability that we can now be at many places at once and calculate precisely the consequences of what we are doing, how do you think it changed the way this fundamental problem that always occurs in war was negotiated? Any thoughts?
طبعا هنا
I need a translation tool. Or can someone then translate for me? Yeah. Please speak in Arabic and someone will tell me.
قوة البيانات هنا ترتبط بالتقنية الموجودة عند جمع البيانات. التقنية أيضا سلاح قوي مع جمع البيانات، وشفنا المثال في أفريقيا عندما يعني فقدت التقنية اضطر إلى جمع البيانات يدويا، وربما يعني يحصل خطأ في جمع هذه البيانات.
Can someone please translate, summarize?
Well, he said that the power, the scene shows that the power is for technology, because now everyone can collect data, so he can have the power of data. As the example of Africa, when the technology absent, they have to collect data by their hands, as he said.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, yeah. I got the, thank you, I got the translation. Good point, but the power of the technology also led to the soldier who sat at the button to say, wait a minute, I'm not striking without any clear, because there's a child. I need to give her a chance to walk away. So the power was not automatically used against even the individual. It just split the opinions, right? Any other thoughts? Yeah?
I would say that different articles actually prove the power of numbers. And at the same time, even though some numbers can split the opinions of, for example, different authority people, at the same time, they can also be underestimated. Some people would say, okay, if only one person is affected, why should I do? Why should I care? And that's why it's really very important how these numbers, how we are quantified as persons, how we lose our identity just because we're a number. So I think it's a very relevant topic, and we have to take this really seriously. How we are quantified by our governments, how we lose sometimes our human face just because we are a number.
Very good point. I couldn't have said it better, actually.
تقاطع المعلومات وأهميتها، يعني هناك كان عندهم معلومات بس خطأ في عملية التعامل، يعني قصف هذه المرأة راح يسبب قتل آخرين، ممكن يقاطعون المعلومات مع الحكومة بسبب اعتقال هذه المرأة أو أي شخص غير موثوق فيه، يعني المشكلة مو مهم جمع المعلومات، وشلون التعامل مع المعلومات، يعني قبل شوية يقول احنا ممكن نقتل 80 واحد مع هذه المرأة، عندما كانت وحدها ممكن تقتلها وتهدم بنى تحتية معها. الافضل هو كان انه اوصل معلومات، شلون اتعامل مع اوصل معلومات للجهات المعنيه حتى يكون اعتقال افضل من عمليه تدمير، يعني قتل الشخص تدمير عدده. شكرا.
المعلومات المعلومات والبيانات هي موجودة منذ القدم، لكن ليش احنا بهاي الفترة نشوف انه هي برزت اهميتها؟ ولاحظنا ظهور صحافة البيانات، الانفوغراف، نلاحظ اغلب دول العالم بدها تهتم بالبيانات. هل فرضتها هذه التقنية الحديثة وانه المواطن ضاع بين كم المعلومات والبيانات فاحتاج توضيح لهذه البيانات والمعلومات، ام انه هي البيانات والمعلومات موجودة منذ القدم ونفس الاستخدام ونفس الأهمية، لكن بروز التقنية الحديثة أجبرت الكثير على التعامل معها، ويعني بدينا نعرف مصطلح البيانات والمعلومات من خلالها. شكرا.
شكرا لأنه استخدمتي هالفيلم، لأنه بتذكر لما حضرته صرت أوقف وأقعد إنه أتفاعل، وهم كانوا أصلا بيتفاعلوا مع الطفلة اللي كانت بتبيع الخبز، فبعثوا لها حدا يشتري الخبز، وما كانت إنه تروح. طمعت البنت لما اشتروا منها الخبز، فراحت اشترت خبز تاني وطمعت عشان تبيعه. فكان التفاعل حتى العسكري أو المسؤول عن إطلاق القنبلة كان بتفاعل مع هذه المعلومات ومع الشاشة، إنه صار يحكوا معها إنه يلا تحركي أو عشان أنا ألقي القنبلة. بذكرنا في أخلاقياتنا كصحفيين، ياما بنمر في مواقف من هذا القبيل وبنصير على المحك ما بين الأخلاقيات الإعلامية ما بين إنسانيتنا كناس طبيعيين. فهذا اللي صار مع هذا العسكري، وبعدين قرروا أن يحسبوا أقل يعني ضرر ممكن من إلقاء القنبلة، لكن في النهاية بيتم إلقائها وتتضرر الطفلة.
Yes, precisely. This is why I've shown it, because I think the movie makes this so powerfully clear. I think linking your comments here, of course, precisely, this information has always existed. It wasn't available for so many people and entities, not just citizens, anyone, corporations, military, etc. But it kind of made us much more sensitive and vulnerable to the rhetoric of numbers, to the rhetoric of looking at people not just as meaning-making animals, but as quantified entities, right? It changes the way of thinking about lives, as you rightly say, because it's no longer, numbers don't trigger the same ethical impulses as the face of a person does. I mean, that's the manipulation effect of media. You've heard, I'm sure, a lot about it in the course of this. And at the same time, this rhetoric of quantification, of abstraction of people's lives that goes with the rhetoric of numbers. Very important also for the journalist, increasingly as we are becoming data journalists in some form or another, doing an infographic, as you mentioned, or working with a data set somewhere, to not lose sight that each individual, that there's an individual in the data points, right? And that kind of broadens and narrows our ethical choices in many interesting ways. And to tell you what I mean by this is, I'm kind of jumping forward. To not lose what I mean by broadening and narrowing our ethical choices, I mean this. Anyone roughly familiar with the concept of utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is one of the core foundational theories of ethics, which basically assesses every situation similar to what you've seen is whatever brings the maximum benefits to the greatest number of people is the thing that is ethically preferable or justified over just singling out on one instance or one person's benefits, right? That's what commonly known as utilitarianism. And it's very American, market liberals love it, because it's kind of, let the market decide, right? The market is always kind of, whatever benefits the majority, it's kind of a self-organizing method of decision-making, right? Against this stand more normative ethics, like Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, who would insist on there are some fundamental core values that apply to every single situation and circumstance regarded. And it's only those which include truth, justice, and human life, dignity, respect for the individual person. They are so universal that they should not be compromised whatever the circumstances. And people, and that's the most important point, human beings should never be used as a means to an end. So these are the fundamental kind of, the extreme ends of ethical positions to be taken, right? There's of course no ethical decision that gives you these easy two options, right? It's always in between and together combining those two where you have to find some way of solution, right? But is utilitarianism, which is still very dominant, like the whole debate in fact about, in America at least, why the use of so much personal data for commercial purposes, surveillance purposes, military purposes, all sorts of purposes, why this is justified, is because it makes our services better. It makes the performance of government better. It makes our country safer. America first again, right? So it can, I'm saying this, utilitarianism, the alleged benefit of society at large, can easily be abused to kind of wash over legitimate gross violations of individual and personal rights of the individual person sitting in the data, for instance. And to give you another example, this is a diagram I found actually from within the debate among humanitarian researchers who study data ethics in the context of humanitarianism. This is a calculation, again, not about death and life decisions, but responding to the situation of Darfur, what I've shown you. Using mobile phone data or location data to identify the settlement of a particular community, what are the risks if you do that for them to be then used for ethnical killings, and what are the benefits of you having this map and being able to save them precisely because you know now what they are, where they are, and you can kind of shield them off from enemies who might attack them, right? And so he's trying to calculate and compare how the trade-offs, right to personal information and privacy, compare to risks that are involved when you use this information in a situation of war, right? It's a very abstract diagram, right? But basically what the diagram is telling us is there's kind of a fluctuation. The risk of this information to be abused is not always the same. It's the highest in moment of acute conflict, right? And so what he's actually saying is, at the moment of high conflict, concerns for privacy have the least priority because the risk to the human life is the greatest. So using information that you took without consent can be justified because the risk of the person losing her life anyway is too great, right? But then of course changes over time as the conflict slows down and people are no longer under immediate threat. And as that happens, in this diagram, the need for respecting privacy goes up, right? And so it's another way of using numbers and calculation to support ethical decision making, right? Are you convinced? Does it sound like a good kind of tool to help you in your ethical decision making? Yeah? Microphone?
I think this exact model of the ends justify the mean, or this kind of approach is exactly what some governments tend to use, to employ, when they find that their countries are in a state of somewhat, they're like more stable. They cause this instability or this or instill this sense of fear to be able to use that threat of danger and threat of being unsafe to tap into people's private lives for data collection.
Mm.
So I think this can be misused by some governments.
Or even humanitarian practitioners, right? Let's take a brief look how he kind of explained his model. He says, the right to privacy is not an absolute right, which is true because it changes according to context. Even you when you watch a Netflix movie, you agree to give up certain privacy because they will use the data, what you've watched and for how long, for their own kind of programming, marketing, whatever purposes, right? So we always trade with our privacy. So he rightly says privacy is not an absolute right. It may be limited in order to achieve a legitimate objective. And here life-saving would certainly be a legitimate objective. The extent to which this right is infringed, however, must be proportional to the objective achieved. So is a violation of privacy, that's precisely the comparison he makes, at what point in the fluctuation of risk and privacy harms is the harm of privacy justified in the face of an immediate threat to the person's life. And so he tries to kind of visualize this proportional distribution. And I explained it when the risk, as the risk goes down, the right to privacy should be increased in his opinion. But he ends in this kind of murky thing. Of course, it's kind of, you know, much more research is needed and there are additional factors playing in. So it doesn't give you a definite answer, yeah?
I wanted to add something to this topic. I find it very interesting what it's actually legitimate aim or goal, and of course this other opinion that a lot of governments really misuse this just as a mean to misuse data. And one example which occurred to me is actually that a lot of airports use our data just to fight terrorism. But at the same time, these data which is collected can be a mean to stigmatize certain people. And a lot of, since that is collected by technologies are sometimes supposed to make some mistakes. And these mistakes can be, I think, very, very dangerous for some people. And if I may share a personal experience of mine, when I was flying from Germany to my home country, Bulgaria, and then all of a sudden when I was by check-in, all of a sudden everything started just like a very strange noise started occurring, and all of a sudden I was just like taken by two policemen without questioning, without any explanation. Then I ended up in a room, they take my fingerprints, nobody told me anything. Anyway, things turned out good for me. The actual reason was that my data, or me, like my facial expression, looks very, very similar to another girl, which is a part of a terroristic group. And I find it really very funny at the very beginning. The only disadvantage was that there were a lot of people around me which saw this. And when I was waiting for my flight, I really can guarantee you that there were no people sitting next to me. And even one little child wanted to approach me to play with me, and the mother just grabbed him. And I was like, okay, that's actually really real. I'm stigmatized for a certain period of time. Okay, the problem is not that I was stigmatized for 2 hours. The problem is that if this happens to me in another country, which is very strict, I might end up in jail without explanation and without the right to justify myself or the right to somehow protect myself. So we really have to bear in mind that these technologies might have a really destructive power on the individuals. We're like losing our human face, so just because we're a number or this number is similar to another number which is dangerous. Let's put it this way.
Exactly. Thank you for sharing this. It's a very powerful example, and it hits precisely the point I'm trying to make. This is the reason why utilitarianism, whatever benefits the maximum amount of people is the ethically justified position, is fundamentally flawed when it comes to information about people that can affect individual lives in disproportionate ways. Being singled out, being stigmatized, etc., or being letting you live or letting you die, right? Very good point. That's precisely why utilitarianism is the wrong logic to approach this question of how do we manage this relationship in which we exist with our data. because the context change all the time, and because abstraction always involves a generalization. The profile of this alleged terrorist, right? They had now a certain contour of this person, right? So it's a generalization, a kind of a general depiction of this person, and everyone that's in this range automatically becomes this person in a way, right? And the same happens with this risk diagram. Why it's fundamentally flawed in my view is, how do you produce such a diagram? How do you come up with this curve? Who makes the decision when is a risk, and when isn't a risk anymore, right? What counts as a risk in the first place? On what basis do you determine when this risk goes up or down? What do you factor in? Just the people having guns? Or other people, hackers who unexpectedly come in possession of this information and do something else with it? There's so many unknown, unpredictable components involved in situations where data can be abused that you can never model them into your predictive model, right? And so, coming back to the rhetoric of numbers, it always sounds extremely convincing and looks very convincing to have these curves and to have these kind of scanned kind of environment, this degree of damage when we strike here, and it assumes that you can strike with precision in the first place. The power of the child is precisely because it summarizes the degree of unpredictability that is always involved, no matter how big your data set, no matter how powerful your algorithms. You can never computate the unexpected, the incomputable, right? And that's not just a pathetic way of saying we should respect individual lives. No, we all live in a datafied world where the life, and that's my point, is inseparable from the data and the multiple versions of data in which it exists. It's just this extension of human lives as data sets that we need to factor into this very good and old human impulse to have respect for the dignity of the individual person. What can this mean when the individual person is no longer sitting in front of us as an enfleshed person, but is a data point in an Excel sheet? How do we square this difference, where the subjective individual is always already part of an objectified environment? That is the fundamental problem that sits at the heart of data agency with which we started, right? And just to give you a different perspective on data, now one way to think about data as a way out or way forward, how to understand data agency, comes from a famous information philosopher who says, data are part of my inviolate personality. It's something that is untouchable and should be untouchable and should legally and ethically be protected as such, right? If you touch my data, I think the phrase he uses, the my in my information is not the same as the my in my car. It's not an object I own because I've bought it. The my in my information is the same as the my body, my feeling. It's an integral part of my being, of my existence in the world. And that is a fundamentally different way of thinking about data than we usually do when we encounter all these discussions about privacy. Because privacy still assumes data as this object out there to be protected because it is somehow related to us. But it treats it still as an object of security and precaution and care. But it doesn't strike the balance that this data, as it sits there as an entity, is at the same time an integral part of my existence here, because without that connection it wouldn't even exist, right? And so touching my data is a violation of my personality, and in Floridi's view, a form of aggression towards my personal identity. And to think of data violations in terms of acts of aggression, it may sound exaggerated. But once you start to strike this connection between data and the person as one, as inseparable ethical substance, it becomes more feasible and more tangible why abuse or use of data for whatever purposes can be perceived as such an act of aggression. Just think about unwanted advertising. It's aggressive. And so I won't spend too much time to it. What's our time frame anyways? The core limits of the Western legal tradition on which data rights are currently built is that it still treats data as an object that we own, but ignores to and does not fully recognize data as an integral part of ourselves. And just to leave you with a nice quote, the way forward for thinking data agency is not something that simply belongs to us controlling this object of data out there. What we need is really to understand data agency as an environmental policy. The moment we exist always already as data in the environment in which we live, we can no longer think data agency as something that just concerns the individual person. Data agency becomes an ethic of how we relate to and manage our data-fied environment, the data-fied society in which we live. And I would love to go into detail with this. Those of you who are religious persons or know the scriptures at least, I think one of the most powerful promises for thinking data ethics as an environmental is really very much the teachings of the Quran and the Islamic philosophy in general, which has a radically different conception than the Western legal traditions in terms of obligations, ethics, that we have in relation not just to other human beings, but to the wider environment and in which we live. I just leave you with this thought because it would take me another hour to explain what I mean by this. But because it very much connects to what an American person in this case is saying, we are ourselves composed as subjects through the operations of cosmic processes that involve increasingly not just the air and water and other elements, but data and sensory-based information. So that it inevitably extends our presence in the world and connects us to the informational dimension of the world in so many technically enhanced ways that we become inseparable. We don't exist independent of these media objects that are traveling out there in the world about us. So the distinction between the subjectivity of the person and the objectivity of the environment in which it lives, it completely breaks down once our presence extends through data into and becomes an integral part of this environment. And so he suggests to think of data as a society forming event in its own right, but as a society that connects us to all other elements that exist out there and makes us as one and requires a different ethical imagination as something taking care of the environment of which we are already part as living individual beings. That is ending on a very complicated note, but maybe you have questions for me to clarify further. Yes?
Thank you very much. Your speech is excellent. You spoke about data for people, for media, for governments, for institutions. Let me say something a little bit out of context, please. The film which you have shown is an ideal thing. The reality is something different. The United States, maybe they have the information, but repeatedly, several times, they bombed civilians. And the justification was that there is a terrorist there. The Israelis did the same. They bombed buildings, killing tens, sometimes hundreds of people. So either they don't have information or data, or they do have, but they don't care. So this film is a public relations to enhance the United States picture in the world. But the reality is different. I wish if the data is used positively, and not in an ideal way. Last thing is, what I said is not, I'm not defending the terrorists, no. We have to fight terrorism in all means, but at the same time, killing civilians with this justification is something really rejected. Thank you.
Of course, you're completely right to say that the film is an idealization, and of course, more often than not, we have seen that this information is abused and completely used the other way. Like I said, that's precisely the risk of this generalization and the objectification. And what numbers do, I mean, we all remember the moment Colin Powell sitting there with the satellite images, with the calculations. They are there. We can see them. Fake news in this case about the alleged weapons of mass destruction. So, of course, yes, this is our reality. But what I was trying to get at is, it's precisely because of this gross imbalance of possibilities that when we think about data agency, and I'm bringing back now what I forgot to tell you, my last optimistic example, we need to start thinking how we can level the playing field here. And we will never be able to match with the Pentagon in terms of what they can see and do, and etc., right? But to give you an example, what it means to think differently about how we can reclaim our rights and at least reclaim some of these tremendous capacities of controlling lives through the calculation of numbers, right? Let me show you an example from the camps here. This is Busha Jamali, one of the camps in the south, Palestinian refugee camps. For 70 years, and you can arguably say that this transfer of land ownership and finally the creation of a new state in the historical land of Palestine was again facilitated, at least, not to large part, by a very specific way of calculating numbers, a very specific way of measuring land that destroyed other ways of measuring land that have existed before, and allowed for a redistribution of ownership that then made it appear perfectly legitimate for land to swap hands, out of which, in the long run, land could be created. Point is, the Palestinians know the problem of what happens to you when you are sorted into certain data sets, how you can appear or disappear as a citizen, as a refugee. That has been their situation for 70 years, right? And so, like in KIBERA, when you walk into the camp trying to start collecting information, you are not welcome. Again, another one measuring us, so what are you taking us away from us this time, right? So they have lived with this for decades, right? But instead of giving up, what this camp has done is, it has started to think about how can we actually make use of this and benefit from all these new information tools that are out there, right? And look what they have done. Very low tech, because there's no internet connection in the camp, or if there is, it's very slow. What they have done is, they took a simple balloon, put a small little photo camera on top of it, and put the balloon up in the air. And started to take photos like this. That's kind of a strip of the camp. And the important part of this photo is this part. Because the reason why they were doing this, they were negotiating, we don't have a garden, the camps are so densely built, you can't even see on the street because the neighbor's house is right next to you, right? So very dense living conditions, no one can breathe anymore. And they're like, we need a garden, we need a place where we can actually relax and breathe and the kids can play. But they didn't know where, because they had never ever had a chance to look at the camp from above. That's the look of the army and the look of the military, and Israel in case when it flies over. But they themselves never had a chance to look at it this way. But inspired by all the technologies around there, they're like, can we do this ourselves? And this is what they came up with. And I think it's a very powerful example of people taking control of the infrastructure of technology around them to improve their own look at themselves and use the extended possibilities of understanding and seeing yourself through data for their own purposes and ends. And so what they have done is then these aerial photos were then used to produce a map for the camp, because again, no one ever bothered to make a map of the camp, and sit with the entire community and say, so what do you think now? Where should we put our garden? Is it here or here? And of course everyone argued and there was no agreement and it was a big fight, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that they started a negotiation where every single point, every single person wasn't just a data point, but could speak and raise their voice, right? Talk back to the data in the first place and have a say in how it's now used in terms of where the garden will be, how big it is, and what is planted there, etc. And so, it's this what I mean when I say we need to start thinking about data agency as environmental, as us being one with the technological infrastructure and the data that exists around us, and narrowing the circle of control and grasp that we can have over it.
Yes.
In the beginning, you mentioned that absent is one type of data. Would you explain more about this point?
Well, just think of one important database is actually a database of absences, the data of missing people in Lebanon, right? That's a philosophical form of absence. So it's basically information about people where the absence of their current location, if it's up there or down there or wherever, right? This missing piece of information, where are you alive or dead, is a data point in and of itself. That's one. Or if you test, I don't know, your immune efficiency, the absence of a certain thing that we know needs to be there for you to be immune against a certain disease becomes an information point in and of itself, right? So things like this. It becomes a basis of comparison. If Lebanon doesn't kind of, like what's missing from the state budget, right? Just measuring our state deficit, right? It's full of absences, right? Income's missing, taxes missing, electricity payments missing. If you compare them in terms of the capacities of a country, all those absences become kind of data points that tell decision makers, the World Bank, this is where you fail. It becomes... Yeah, it's a negative measure. It's to identify what's missing or what's needed or what, to then decide what needs to be done. Yeah?
Yeah. I want to ask about something, the data checking process. What if the data were taken on a wrong basis, or some perspectives were intentionally dismissed only to prove a point, and only to execute a decision that was even made before collecting these data? The second point is the data through digital platforms. Maybe we as journalists daily, with every article we write, with every report, we deal with data through digital platforms, and we don't have tools to make sure that these data we collect are really right. And even we as journalists, our reports or our work is evaluated by numbers, not by its journalistic value, but the engagement you get, how you attracted audience, how many likes, shares, and comments. So we are also in a struggle that we want to present a valuable content, checked and well-written, and only present facts, and at the same time we need to grab audience's attention by, I don't know, by picture, by headline or something. So this is adding to what Karina said, that we as journalists also identify people to numbers. So this content may grab those attention, or this word may grab this specific audience attention. So I need to hear your answer.
Good point. I didn't, please repeat the first one. I didn't get the first point you made.
first point, I was saying that what if the data collected were collected on a wrong basis? It was not right data, or some perspectives were dismissed.
So if the information is wrong, you say?
Yeah. What if the data was not right? And
so what then?
Or
what is your question?
I mean, some governments, for example, they want to take specific decision in area or something on a governmental sector, in health, economic, and so on, and the data they present, we are not really clear sure of. Maybe some perspectives were intentionally dismissed, only to prove that this decision is the right decision, and it's not the right decision.
Responding to your points, from an environmental understanding of data power and data agency, the first point would be government data can never be held within government circles. The very function of government as elected body to represent the interest of the people demands that every single data set that exists there and will be used to affect the very interests of these societies has to be public, right? So that people like you, the journalists or activists, can check, is the data actually correct? I would disagree with you on the point that we don't have tools to check the data. I myself do workshops here, invite people very sophisticated from Bahrain. I think he can. He showed us how to verify images, metadata, using all those things. There are tremendous, there are even entire organizations specializing just in the verification of all these kind of social medias flying out of Syria, right? There are entire collectives driven by very motivated journalists. This is a profession in and of itself by now. So sorry, no more excuses on that one. But on the third point, that's a really important point. Again, I've worked in journalism for a long time, and this was precisely one of the reasons why I didn't really want to just do journalism anymore. This pressure of the ratings, it was long before the invention of the internet, but it's intensified in unexpected, in unimaginable ways. So, of course, you are in a lot of pressure and you are subject to the number of rhetorics. But the answer is not to despair, but to make the numbers speak to journalistic values. And in the circles where research is taking place now, this is precisely the task that we have now, right? How can we make algorithms work, not just to follow the utilitarian principle, maximum rating, obviously the market has made a choice, this is what people want, to not just follow the utilitarian principle and always serve the terror of the majority, but to go back to what media principles were, at least in the public realm, public media were always about. Serving minority interests, representing all voices equally in society, bringing out things that people did not expect, didn't know they could want, because it's only through these core journalistic values that we can live up to our mandate. And I know of one research group in Germany, for instance, who are doing precisely this. They are working on an algorithm that operates on the logic of public broadcasting as we've known it ever since just recently. And I think it's brilliant. This is another powerful example for what it means to think about data agency, data power, and our ability to reclaim all the possibilities that are out there, because they are promising and good, can be. How we can reclaim them and make them work for the good if we start thinking about it differently.
Thank you, Monika, for this wonderful lecture. If you have any... If you have, as always, if you have any more questions regarding the lecture, you can always email us or send us a message on Facebook, and we'll try to get the answers for you. The lecture and the presentation will be available on our website. Okay, so for the fun part now, we're going to apply how to create infographics and how to collect data with Hussein Kassab. We're going to go to the SAGE lab. It's the big lab that you did not visit yet on campus. Mona, Khalid, and where's Joel? And Joel will take you to the lab now. We'll finish at 12:30, hopefully, or 12:50. And that's it for the rest of the day. Thank you.